Hello everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us today for another edition of IRENA Insights webinar series. My name is Martina Lyons and I'm from the IRENA Innovation and Technology Center in Bonn. Most of you know who IRENA is, but let me make a quick introduction of who we are. We are an intergovernmental organization with currently 161 member countries and 22 countries in accession. We support countries in their transition to a sustainable energy future and serve as the principal platform for international cooperation, a center of excellence, and a repository of policy, technology resource, and financial knowledge on renewable energy. Our analytical work and our engagement with our members generates a lot of valuable insights, and we are constantly looking for more ways to share those insights with you. And that's what brings us to our fortnightly IRENA Insights webinar program, where every other week we share with you key insights, key findings from our latest work, offer you insights into opportunities, trends, best practices, but also innovative solutions to address various challenges. A small caveat, we aim to keep these webinars short, circa 30 minutes, so we cannot cover everything, but we do hope to give you enough to decide whether to delve deeper into the topic. And we signpost in our presentations further sources of more in-depth information to help you to do that. About today's webinar, IRENA has been tracking and analyzing the cost evolution of renewable power since 2012 to shed light on the accelerating momentum of renewables as both the key climate solution and a strong business proposition. Today's webinar will present you the latest IRENA report, Renewable Power Generation Cost in 2019, which was published last Tuesday, 7 days ago, and we will share with you today key takeaways from this report and provide you with insights into global cost trends for renewable power and what has driven their cost declines in 2019. Today's speaker is Mr. Michael Taylor, who is IRENA senior analyst and expert on renewable costs. His presentation will be maximum 20 minutes long to allow another 10 minutes for your questions. But before I hand over microphone to Michael, I have a few housekeeping items to cover. Next slide, please. Today's webinar will be, as usually, recorded and available together with the presentation slides on IRENA's webinar website under past webinars. The previous webinar recordings and slides are already there, and we invite you to visit them. The link to the website will be again shared with you in the follow-up email. All of you are currently muted and will remain so throughout the webinar. Next slide, please. We would like to hear from you during today's presentation, so if you have any question to our speaker, please send it to us through the question feature that you can find on the webinar panel. We will be monitoring questions throughout the session and select some to be answered by our speaker. Due to time constraints, we apologize in advance if your question is not answered. You may also download the presentation slides in the handouts section that include all important links to IRENA costing materials. If you experience any technical difficulties, please try to reconnect by dialing in via phone. You can get the number by clicking on the phone option located on the webinar panel. Otherwise, please visit support service on the GoToWebinar website. And without any further ado, let me kick things off by welcoming Michael. Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much, Martina. Welcome everyone to this presentation of the results of renewable power generation costs in 2019. I'm delighted to be able to share with you some of the insights from this report and also enjoy your feedback. A special thank you to those who have got up early or staying up late to be part of this presentation. As Martina said, we have a lot of ground to cover in a short time. So what you're going to see is an overview and of course we have some time for questions afterwards, but we'll be very happy to maintain an ongoing dialogue if you would like to offline after this. So in terms of the work, Martina has already highlighted that this is part of an ongoing effort by IRENA to improve the transparency of up-to-date cost data around renewable power generation technologies and renewable costs in general. Given the rapid evolution of the technology and cost reductions, this plays a vital role in keeping our member states and others up to date with the latest cost data, and as a result, being able to make informed decisions based on the facts available today. It's a big job, and I've got a great team working together to make this happen. So that's an important part of us ensuring that you get these results in a timely manner. In terms of what are some of the main headlines from the analysis, it's what we tend to say every year. So costs are continuing to fall, particularly for solar and wind power technologies. And they've done so to the extent that in most parts of the world today, renewable power generation is often the least cost source of new electricity. And indeed, in 2019, around 56% of all of the capacity added in that year, new capacity added, had a cost lower than the cheapest cost new fossil fuel-fired cost option, which was coal. But it's not just competing head-to-head without financial assistance and even undercutting. It's starting to cut in under the operating costs of an increasing number of existing coal-fired power plants. And we've done some analysis in that respect, which is in the report that you can read. So that's, and it gives you an idea of not only the direction of travel, but just how cheap renewables have become. The cost reductions for solar and wind are particularly coming from improved technology, economies of scale as deployment has grown, more competitive supply chains, and developer experience. So there's a number of factors at play. It varies by technology, and obviously what we're trying to do is extract these insights to inform our member states about what's driving cost reductions in the past, where future ones may be extracted, and what we can learn from other countries in terms of best practice. We have invested a significant amount of resources over the years to develop a very comprehensive database of projects. So we currently have around 18,000 projects in our database, covering information such as the total install cost, capacity factor, and our calculations for the levelized cost of electricity. So this is a lot of data that allows us to extract more insights.
Michael, you are getting a little cut off.
The PPA and auction the reception for you all. Okay, one moment. So in terms of the results, this is one of our competitive advantages in terms of having this extensive database.
Michael, put it
so
in
in terms of the recent cost
slide.
evolution as a result, yeah, hold on. Okay. So the recent cost evolution is seen, here's a chart from left to right: biomass, geothermal, hydro, solar photovoltaic, concentrating solar power, offshore and onshore wind. I'll take a moment to explain this chart. What you see is each circle represents an individual project. The center of that circle is the value for the levelized cost of electricity on the y-axis. The diameter of that circle is the size of the project, to give you an idea of the scale. The solid line that you see here represents the global weighted average levelized cost for each of those technologies between 2010 and 2019. The bands on each of those years and technologies represent the 5th and 95th percentile of projects, and the solid band that you can see across the bottom is the fossil fuel-fired cost range in the G20, which ranges from 5 to around 18 cents per kilowatt hour. So what you see on the left-hand side is the mature technologies offer, they have a very site-specific characteristics, so the annual variation is quite significant, and so the trend tends to vary. But what we see is that they're at the lower end of the fossil fuel cost range and offer, obviously, cost-competitive electricity, which is dispatchable in many cases, and also provides flexibility. Solar PV, utility scale solar PV, has seen a dramatic cost reduction. Levelized cost of electricity has fallen 82% between 2010 and 2019, 47% for concentrating solar power, 29% for offshore wind, and 39% for onshore wind. So very significant cost reductions. And utility scale solar PV and onshore wind are now at the very bottom end of the range for fossil fuel fired costs. And as you can see, a number of projects are undercutting even that lowest range. Now, I mentioned earlier our auction and PPA database. So there is quite a few caveats on this. So I suggest that you read our analysis to understand that, but simply to say that we've made an effort to align as closely as possible the PPA and auction prices to more resemble LCOE. It's difficult to do this, and as I said, there are a number of caveats, but it allows us to have a little bit of a crystal ball into the future. And this chart overlays the auction and PPA prices in orange here, the orange dots, and with the LCOE database data in blue. And the orange and blue lines represent those two databases. And you can see here when we use this data, which tells us about what's going to be commissioned in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, we see that for solar PV, we can see continued cost reductions to a weighted average value for the data that we have, not necessarily the weighted average that will occur in 2021, but that falls to 3.9 US cents per kilowatt hour for solar PV. Concentrating solar power and offshore wind, there's a bit of a step change that's been signaled by these auction and PPA prices. For CSP, we're talking about a handful of projects, so the reality of what occurs in the next couple of years is a bit difficult could be highly variable depending on which one's commissioned, but say in the 7 to 8 cents per kilowatt hour range. Offshore wind between 5 and 10 cents depending on whether it's a mature market, say in Europe, or an emerging one in Asia or North America. And onshore wind, again, going from 5.3 cents per kilowatt hour in 2019 to a global weighted average of around 4.3 cents. So these represent very significant continued cost reductions and give us an indication of what the market is telling us, if you like, in the fact for the next few years. And when you start to dive into these cost reductions, so in 2018 for the solar and wind technologies, we had significant reduction for solar PV, onshore and offshore wind. CSP, as I said, we're talking about a handful of projects each year, so it's much more volatile. And where we look at that cost reduction in electricity between 2010 and 2019, as I said on the previous slide, very significant. But even more so when we push out and look at the entire period to 2021 or 23 for offshore wind. All right, so these cost reductions are actually quite remarkable. There's nothing in our household budget that has fallen in price or cost anything like this over the period. So, and that is quite visible when you start to look at learning rates for these technologies. Now, the learning rate is the percentage reduction in the cost for every doubling of the cumulative installed capacity. And here on the right-hand side, you can see for solar PV and onshore wind on the far right-hand side, which have more deployment. Solar PV has a quite remarkable learning rate of between 38 and 40% over this period. And so if you look at the period between 2010 and say 2021, this actually for each of these four technologies represents say 75 to over 95% of cumulative installed capacity. Situation does look different if you go back further for onshore wind, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But these learning rates, in the order of 35 to 40% for solar technologies, 23 to 29% for onshore wind, and 10% for offshore wind, are really quite remarkable. One new thing we did with this report that we haven't done in the past is looked at the total investment value of projects commissioned in a given year. So this is simply the total installed cost multiplied by the capacity factor collected by our colleagues in the statistics department. And again, obviously with falling install costs, we see quite a remarkable improvement in the value for money. So in 2010, globally 88 gigawatts of renewable power generation capacity was installed, and it required about $210 billion US worth of investment. By 2019, new capacity added had doubled, but the required investment had increased by less than a fifth, actually by 18%. And you can see here the examples for solar PV and offshore wind about what's driving this. So we're getting more bang for our buck in terms of money invested. Now, obviously, at a global level, it's interesting to see the trends in the technology costs. But the reality is, of course, is that costs are very different depending on the country in many cases. So of course, we not only look at different cost metrics to understand what's driving, so total install cost, capacity factors, cost breakdowns, etc. But we also need to do that at country level. And we typically try to do that for the biggest 10 to 15 markets each year for each technology in detail. So very quickly going through some of these in terms of wind power. What we've seen is a technology improvement story where higher hub heights and larger swept areas harvest more electricity for the same resource quality, so higher capacity factors, at the same time as total installed costs have fallen, driven by declines in wind turbine prices from their peak between 2008 and 2010. And obviously those translate into levelized cost of electricity reductions. In recent years, the importance of the technology improvements have become quite significant in terms of driving the cost reduction for onshore wind. So this chart shows the rotor diameter on the y-axis in meters and the nameplate capacity of the turbine on the x-axis. You can see between 2010, we go from bottom left to upper right. That is to say, larger turbine capacity, larger swept areas, which for the same resource typically generates a higher yield, a larger capacity factor. And so that has resulted in improvements more or less across the board for the mature markets. And you can see here data for a range of 15 countries where we have good data, in some cases going back to 1984. So you can see it for the mature markets, Denmark, Germany, the US, United Kingdom, a significant growth as the technology has improved. And that's happened at the same time as costs for the turbines have fallen per kilowatt. And you can see here the evolution essentially for the United States and OECD countries on the upper side of this, where we can see the BNEF wind turbine prices, but also Vestas average selling price. Chinese wind turbine prices are systematically lower because they don't include things like installation and towers, which are part of EPC contracts. So somewhat different structurally, not directly comparable. And of course, you know, if we have total install costs that are falling, capacity factors are increasing, the levelized cost of electricity is going to fall. And when we look at this over the period globally, we see that costs have fallen by around 85% since 1983, 1984. And that represents a lower learning rate than the ones we talked about earlier from 2010, and it drops down to around 14%. I haven't talked about O&M costs as well, but they're also an important part of declining O&M costs are also an important part of this trend. So in terms of solar PV, which has seen the most dramatic, precipitous decline in levelized cost of electricity, total installed costs have fallen by around 79% since 2010 and fallen under a global weighted average value of $1,000 per kilowatt last year. Capacity factors are increased, but this is not a technology story so much as one which is a very welcome one, where we're seeing greater deployment in areas with greater insulation, so better solar resources. And as a result, we saw that 82% reduction overall. A lot of this cost reduction, and we'll come back to this in a minute, is being driven by module cost declines, which have fallen by around 90% since 2010 and are now in the kind of 20 cent to 38 cent per watt range in Europe, with values obviously falling outside that range depending on different markets. And I'd encourage you to look at the report for some more details on that. So those cost reductions of 90% for the module obviously exceed the total install cost. Balance of system costs have fallen a little bit slower in most cases, and you can see that again for a range of 12 markets where we have good time series data here, so that overall total install costs have fallen somewhat less typically, not all cases. So you can see that Australia total install costs have actually fallen exactly the same amount as the global weighted average, but typically slightly less, and so as a result we also get some contribution from falling O&M costs as well. And those have been quite significant actually as well. Now, we've seen a great convergence in total installed cost down to low levels, and that, as you saw from the previous chart, that was quite generalized. But there still rests quite significant cost differentials. So, you know, if you look on the right-hand side, total installed costs in Italy, China, and India are obviously very competitive, and elsewhere there are additional costs. Partly this represents structural issues, say for instance higher labor costs, but in many cases it's policy related, and that's why we collect this granular data to try and identify where shifting to best practice could provide cost reductions for different markets, and we talk about that a little bit in other work as well. And that allows us to do this decomposition. So here's total installed costs between 2010 and 2019. And you can see here that just over 60% of the total cost reduction for total installed costs has come from reductions in module and inverter costs, right, with a cascade of contributions from other components. So what happens to modules and inverters and balance of system costs matters a lot. So all of that requires careful analysis and ideally at a country level. In terms of offshore wind, we talked earlier about this potential coming step change in costs. We've seen the market is somewhat smaller for offshore wind. So what happens in terms of deployment by country, by year, means we see a bit more volatile trend in total installed costs and capacity factors. But since about 2013, total installed costs have been coming down, and in 2019 we're around US 3,800 per kilowatt. And levelized cost of electricity has fallen into the levelized cost of electricity for fossil fuel range at about 11.5 cents per killawatt hour.
Michael, sorry, just a little bit speed up the presentation. We are slightly running out of time. Thank you.
An important issue for offshore wind was initially in the period up to around 2012, we saw a shift to deeper water and offshore. This had implications for costs, installation costs, foundation costs, grid connection costs. So we saw an increase in total installed costs, but this was happening again, like for onshore wind, as we saw a growth in turbine and technology improvement. And so we see this trend coming down since around 2013 in the global weighted average total installed cost. And as we said, concentrating solar power is a bit like offshore wind. It's seen what we're going to see a step change in costs. Again, very small deployment each year. We're talking about a handful of plants, say 500 to 600 megawatts installed in the last few years, so much more volatility, but an increase in capacity factors. So here there's a technology impact and a resource impact. So I'll skip over this, but basically through time we've seen an increase in storage and deployment in areas with higher direct normal irradiance, and that's contributing to those increasing capacity factors. And we can see this, the combination obviously of higher capacity factors and falling total installed costs, lowering LCOE, and then we see the step change with the auction results for 2020 and 21. Finally, just before we wrap up, I haven't focused on this, but we're not forgetting the mature renewable technologies that can provide this dispatchable, flexible, low-cost power. 9/10 of all of the capacity of hydropower added last year had a cost lower than the cheapest fossil fuel-fired cost. Bioenergy continues to remain an important contributor not only to power generation, but renewable heat and combined heat and power, and geothermal, although the market is small, as an important always-on technology. So with that, I will finish there, a little bit over time, and thank you very much for your attention. You can find the report on our website. There is also the opportunity to register to download the data behind all of the charts to assist you with your analysis and presentation.
Thank you, Michael, very much. That was a very thorough, insightful presentation. Slightly running out of time. We hope that you can all stay with us for additional 10 minutes to allow a couple of questions to be answered. So without any delays, let me go directly to those questions we have received so far, including those through the registration. We have plenty to choose from. Thank you all for posting them. So let me start with this one, which looks on the competitiveness of renewables. Michael, looking at the decline of cost, do renewables still need any support?
Well, it depends very much on the market and the institutional frameworks that are in place. I mean, there are many still jurisdictions, unfortunately, where there are significant barriers to the uptake of renewables, and so it very much depends. So for instance, in Europe, which since the global financial crisis, not even taking into account the recent pandemic, where demand has been lethargic. We don't have a need for new capacity. What we do have a need for is avoiding dangerous climate change. So at this stage in Europe, for instance, we definitely do need support because we're essentially having to force out fossil fuel-fired capacity. So we talked earlier about one of the results here is that renewables are increasingly starting to undercut even the marginal costs of fossil fuel-fired plants. But you know, I think that the science is quite clear is that we need an accelerated transition, and therefore we need active policies.
Thank you, Michael. What about this one? What is the reason behind, in the case of the country with renewable costs not yet cheap enough compared to other conventional electricity sources?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of dynamics here that are useful to highlight. The first is that in recent years, we've seen the ability for countries to profit from international developer experience and access to finance to achieve very competitive costs in a short space of time. Now, there are local, you know, obviously important local cost components that require, if you like, a minimum amount of scale and long-term certainty to invest in to have the most competitive cost structures. But what we've seen is that if you have a program, a medium-term program of say 2 to 5 years, what we've seen is that there is no reason for countries not to have very competitive cost structures in that space of time with the right policy and regulatory settings. And so, but it's obviously two components, right? So you need not only that long-term, you know, the medium-term plan, but the fact that you've looked at, you know, electricity market structures and regulatory frameworks, issues around the ease with which project can be developed, and processes which can de-risk the projects as well. So it requires a holistic policy package. You don't necessarily can't look just at the renewable procurement side of it. It has to fit within the overall electricity system regulatory and policy framework.
Thank you, Michael. There is one on hydropower, which we very quickly went through during presentation. So among renewables, hydropower is the only source that recorded an uptake in the 2010-2019 period. Why is this the case?
Yeah, so that trend has now become somewhat clearer than it has in the past. What we've seen is that there's most of the deployment that's occurred over the last 10 years or so has occurred in Asia. So we've seen a lot of deployment in China and elsewhere. And it would seem that on average now, we're starting to get to a point where projects are being developed in areas which are slightly less than ideal compared to those earlier projects. So slightly more difficult site conditions, perhaps more difficult access, so increased logistical costs and grid connection costs and so on. There's also, in the last couple of years, there's also been, if you like, a substitution effect going on that is not reflective of individual country costs, and that China's share of deployment has started to fall. And costs are typically somewhat higher elsewhere. And so what we've seen is part of the reason the costs have increased is because there's a lower share of deployment in China.
Thank you. There are a lot of questions, very similar one, about the future cost reduction potential for the next decade. Are the current falling cost trends likely to continue? And if so, why? Thank you.
Yes. So, I mean, the predominant focus of this report is obviously the most recent historical cost trends with an effort at our crystal ball through the auction and PPA results. But we're actually near to finalizing an analysis of the cost reduction potential for solar and wind technologies to 2030 in each of the G20 countries, and that work will probably be released in Q3 or Q4 this year. The results are not finalized, obviously, but they're, I'm happy to spoil the headline in advance, in that there is continued cost reduction opportunities to come. So these are a combination of technology improvements. As we saw for some of solar PV, partly it's around a more generalized shift to best practice in terms of perhaps installation, project development, etc., and ongoing benefits from competition, economies of scale, and the more generalized deployment, particularly for solar and wind, where in the past, you know, the top 5 countries typically accounted for, say, 70 to 80% of deployment. And so we're now seeing a much more generalized growth and deployment, which is also helping regional kind of cost chains as well.
Thank you. Let's have 2 more questions before we close. There are a lot of questions about COVID-19. Maybe we can touch a little bit on that and the impact on renewable power costs.
Yes. So, I mean, the most immediate effect of COVID-19 has been that while renewable power generation deployment has continued to grow over the last 4 to 5 months, demand has fallen. And so what we've seen is an uptick in the share of renewable power generation particularly in Europe, but also in North America and elsewhere. So obviously that's a short-term phenomenon, but obviously it impacts the competitiveness of a lot of these existing fossil fuel assets, right? So the ability of new renewables to undercut existing fossil fuel assets this year has taken a bump because the fixed costs are not being quite as much recovered by fossil fuel assets. Longer term, I mean, the jury is still out about whether we really see a significant drop in deployment of renewables this year. Clearly, in a number of countries, the following stimulus packages that will attempt to repair some of the economic damage that has been done by the pandemic are likely to include a strong green energy component. So the medium-term outlook may actually improve. At this stage, it looks like perhaps solar PV deployment will remain at about the same level as last year. Onshore wind, perhaps about the same as well. So, but it's too early to tell, I think.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Last questions, with which we'll wrap up. You already touched upon that, but there are still a lot of questions about the access to the background documents for research purposes. So where people can access that? Yeah, so
if you go to IRENA.org, which is on this last slide here, and our publications page, you will come to a link to the report. On that page, you can download the report, and there's also a link where you can include your contact details and receive an Excel sheet, which includes the data for all of the charts in the report. It doesn't include every single project that you see on some of those charts because of confidentiality issues. So some of the project data that we have is confidential, and also simply the unwieldiness of the data set. But essentially, if you have a specific request that goes beyond any of that, you can contact me directly or costs@irena.org, and we'll do our best to make sure you get what you need for your work.
Thank you, Michael. Unfortunately, the time is up. Thank you for sending us a lot of insightful questions to choose from and so much to learn from you, Michael. Thank you very much for sharing all these insights and your experience with us all. Let me finish this very interesting webinar with a couple of final announcements. If I can ask you 2 slides further to be able to reflect on the delivery of our webinar and ways to improve it, and also what else you would like us to cover in the future editions. We would appreciate your feedback. We would like to invite you to complete a very short satisfactory survey, which will appear at the end of the webinar, and the link will be shared with you in the follow-up email. We are monitoring your comments, and we work on selecting topics of your interest and trying to shift times of webinars to accommodate various time zones. Thank you in advance for completing the survey, which has been very helpful. And last but not least, we would like to invite you to our next edition of this fortnightly webinar series, where we will discuss what holds advanced biofuels back. Whilst representing a third of global energy demand, the transport sector has the lowest level of renewable energy use today, and biofuels can offer readily available solutions for decarbonizing transport as an alternative to fossil fuels, and as a complement to the enhanced role of electric mobility. IRENA climate-friendly scenario indicate that the 5-fold increase of biofuels would be needed by 2050. However, many barriers are holding back their scale up. So our next webinar, which will be based on the 2019 report, Advanced Biofuels, What Holds Them Back, will share practical insight into the complex business environment and discuss ways forward. It will take place in 2 weeks' time on Tuesday, 23rd of June and 10 a.m. Central European summertime. You can register on our IRENA website. The link is shared here in the presentation with you, and you will receive a follow-up email with the link as well. So that is all from us for today. Once again, thank you, Michael, and all of you for joining us today. Goodbye and see you soon.